So good morning, it's Christopher Forster here. This is Crumbs under the table. It is an absolutely boiling hot day. If I take my hat off, it will disgustingly, probably a whole load of water will come pouring out, but I'm stopping my top of my head from burning. So anyway, just kind of been thinking around a load of things this morning, and if I raise them all, it will probably be going on for about 45 minutes, which is not the intention. I originally thought we'd try and do these at about under 10 minutes. Nowadays I'm pleased when I keep them under 20, which is not great, because the idea is they're supposed to just be kind of quick, short thoughts, get us inspired or thinking of the Lord for the day. And that whole thing of thinking is so kind of key. And that's part of what I was thinking about the thinking side of things. I can't remember why I started off like that. But actually I was thinking originally about maybe doing something on the kind of subject of trust, and I was thinking about work that's been done by a guy who started off as an economist and moved into psychology. He's a professor, Paul Zak. He was kind of sometimes refers to himself as the vampire economist, because he takes people's blood, and he kind of showed a very strong correlation between issues of trust and oxytocin, which shouldn't be a big surprise, and actually just how it goes up and down in the moment. And this is why you have to take blood all the time when you're doing the tests in people's bloodstream. But the key thing really, I'll just let these folks walk past. Morning. Thank you. So we're just here on the bridge now. Dogs have, oh yeah, there's one in the water. There you go. What it is about when the dogs swim, it's always fun to watch in the video for some reason. Well, I think so anyway. So yes, that's right. The kind of, if you like, the caveat with all of the thing in terms of the relationship of oxytocin to going to go through all the green, are you there, Banjo? Nice. Is of course that when it comes to anything in psychology, you can never kind of claim, well, that made me do it. Your genes didn't make you do it. Your hormones didn't make you do it, because oxytocin's a hormone. Your childhood didn't make you do it. Your social context didn't make you do it, because in the end there is a huge complex mix. But one of the key important things actually, which I think kind of comes out nicely from the kind of Paul Zak's work, as I say, he makes a strong play, because it's kind of become where he's gone to on things within the workplace that you can kind of encourage and develop levels of oxytocin in people, and work with that to kind of create a more trusting environment. And a more trusting environment costs less, and companies that actually have those things, he's demonstrated, do better in the long term, because they have less internal costs because of the greater levels of trust, etc. So real winners there. But the thing that's really interesting is it's not an absolute case, and I'm interested in the bit that kind of sits behind it. In other words, oxytocin can encourage you to take a risk with people and expand your kind of social of good behaviour towards folks, but equally it can cause you to kind of create a harder line with those who are outside and treat them worse. And so the question is, well, what's the difference? It doesn't automatically mean that, it just often means that. What's the difference? Well, actually I think the answer kind of comes from a different sphere of psychology, which is where we get the term social construct. And often we kind of can react to that because you hear some of the stupidity that goes around. Sex is not a social construct; it's a biological reality. Behaviours within your gender, those can be social constructs. I.e., do you wear dresses or do you wear trousers? That kind of thing. Those are. And it doesn't mean, and there's often a kind of a place where we kind of take social constructionism to kind of become a thing where anything you can construct in your head is just as real as anything else, which it isn't. Death is a social construct, but you kind of change the way you believe about it, doesn't stop people dying. So all of those kind of things. But from that sphere, what you have is a very clear, demonstrable truth, which is that the stories and objects which a culture gives you to think with hugely impact the way those other things influence you in your life. So raised oxytocin in an environment that has a story that wants to grow in love will kind of tend to produce ongoing growing. But in a context of a story which is where love is now closed door and it's a set circle, it will create a kind of a harder edge at those things. And so there's a kind of an interesting, very kind of clear, I think, demonstrable interplay. And that always fascinates me, because the Bible, right from the Old to the New Testament, is always going on about how at the end what God is most interested in are the thoughts that emerge from the heart, right, the deepest thoughts in who we are. But there's an interesting, sorry, it's a slight aside. There's an interesting little interview I saw, or not an interview, it was a kind of a debate between Sam Harris, who's sometimes referred to as one of the four horsemen of the non-apocalypse. He's one of the kind of four atheist writers that's most kind of gone for the Christian faith. He was in a debate and with Jordan Peterson, who kind of takes, who's a Jungian psychologist, could become famous for standing up for free speech. But of course, as a Jungian psychologist, Jordan Peterson is very aware of the importance of the narrative stories and the archetypes that we carry, the images, the kind of things that we aspire to, and so on. And he makes this point very strongly to Sam. He says, so when you get rid of Christianity, he said, what story are you going to replace it with? How are you going to replace Jesus? And Sam Harris responds, well, it's a kind of, we can say what a good person is supposed to be like. And he says, that won't have anything of the emotive force. Do you think that will be able to replace it? And he said, you're dicing with something you don't really understand. So he's not making an argument to say whether Christianity is true or not. What he's saying is if you got rid of the gospel story, the world is going to be in a much worse place, because it's a story that gets into us with weight. Even those who don't really follow it kind of feel it with weight. And it's a story where power subjects itself for the sake of love. It's a story that lays down its life for its friends. It's a story that puts morality and good behaviour, and it puts children at a high level. And historians, as they look through the world, recognise, and it kind of partly it came up in my thinking because I saw a comment on the Epstein case that's going through at the moment, with the trafficking of young women, and kind of talking about how we have to extend and understand that it's not just purely kind of a sales transaction, in the sense of when you buy a car, it's a coercive thing. It's about creating a culture that drives people through a certain way of behaving. It becomes very hard, therefore, to prove, but it's still nonetheless very real. And how do we deal with this? And within all of that mix, it made a comment about how Epstein had apparently some years back made a statement about that's just the way the world is. When people have men have power and the money, they want younger well, children, basically, is what he's driving at, and saying they were kind of commenting on how disgusting it is, and the civilised world doesn't think that way. But as somebody else then pointed out, the trouble is Epstein is right, that actually it is Christendom that has been the aberration in those things, that has kind of honoured, and not perfectly, but this is because it's part of the way that the gospel gets into us and works, which is we have our baser instincts, and sex and power do get all mixed up. There's that famous quote, which I can't remember who said it. I remember seeing it on the dramatisation of House of Cards, where it says Frank Field. That's terrible. That's the Labour MP. Frank Underwood, who's the villain in the American version, says everything's about sex except for power, except for sex. That's right. Everything's about sex except for sex, which is about power. And this kind of mix of the two. You add kind of money, sex and power, and actually you can find that right the way in the beginning of Genesis, because if you equate money with value, God looks over them and says you're good, and the Hebrew word for good is also precious. You're valuable, you have value. God declares over them, and then he says be fruitful, and you need some, and fill up the earth, where you need some sex for that, and have dominion, so you need some power for that. So written into the human psyche is a need for value. There is a kind of a drive that is about reproduction and sex, and there is a dominion, there's a power dynamic, and they all get confused and they all get mixed up. And you take, if you like, the purposeful dynamic, you take the relationship, you take the declaration into the human soul that you are valuable already, And actually they all get very confused, trying to grab one thing from the other, trying to get value from our sexual relationships, trying to express power in our sexual relationships, using our power to get sex, using our power to get money, using the money that we have to buy power. You see, they all get confused together, and it becomes a horrible, horrible mess. And so anyway, the point that was being made was that actually the huge swathe of human history actually tells us that Epstein was correct. In many sense, he is just a natural expression of the way the world is if you take the gospel out of it. That the values which a kind of a secular world takes for granted have emerged very uniquely within a context which has a narrative at its heart, which is the gospel narrative, which actually has these remarkable things in it. That the ultimate power should subject itself for the sake of love. That actually Jesus should affirm both the place of children, when he says, let them come to me. In other words, they can have close access to the guru. And also to women, when he not only affirms Mary for listening to the teaching, but we then straight after that we find him teaching parables that only made sense to women because men didn't get involved in the things that he tells the story of the lost coin about, for instance. So you find actually within Jesus, and the kind of the cynical can look back and say, oh, it's not as good as a feminist manifesto. Well, it's not, because it's not a feminist manifesto. But it's something that actually moves and changes our direction as the Spirit works in our hearts as we adopt these narratives and these stories as having authority within us. And they become part of the inner workings of our mind. They become part of the constructs, the social constructs, but this is actually the spiritual constructs that are deep in who we are. And there's a great little verse where David is talking to Solomon. So it's in the Old Testament. So it's in 1 Chronicles, and I checked this one out so I remember because I knew I wouldn't remember it. It's 1 Chronicles 28, and then verse 9, where David is kind of saying, do well, etc., etc. And he says, approach God with my English says perfect heart, but the word perfect is the word shalem. It's the same as Solomon, Shalom, which is the name from Shalem. So it's actually kind of part of Solomon's name, with a perfect heart, but it means a kind of a balanced, well-being, kind of at ease heart. Approach God like that, and with a desiring mind, a mind that wants to know him. And then it kind of goes on and says, because God looks at those things, and those that he sees have got those qualities, he makes himself known to, and he doesn't with those that don't. And I kind of at the heart of it, and I'm not quoting it correctly because I always kind of lose the flow, it's just kind of one of those that popped into my head, but you can look it up. I've given you the exact reference. Because it kind of fits very well when Jesus says, if you seek, you will find. There's something about actually the narratives within us, if they are genuinely looking for that place of rest and well-being, they're genuinely looking and desiring to discover, as opposed, if you like, to trying to exert ourselves and all of the agitation and stresses that come with that, as opposed to actually kind of cynically wanting to reject all that's good. And sadly, people get into that state. They don't think they'd start that way, but it starts very often with the kind of the simple selfishnesses that despises things that other people have that seem to make them happy and you don't have. And in the end, it kind of grows into this monster that kind of almost works against life, and tragically leaves people never appreciating the moments they have, and yet at the same time having a belief system that believes that the only moments they have are the ones in front of them, and yet they can't enjoy them. It's that great tragedy. And the antidote to it is often the leavening in. I know there can be the dramatic breakthroughs, but often it's the leavening in of the hope of a different way of thinking with peace, of being able to think differently about the world, of having different narratives, which is why I think it's so important, in Psalm 78, which is one of my kind of favourite psalms, quite a big long one, and it's not got natty things, but it's got so much depth in it, where it says, teach these things to your children, teach these stories, teach these parables, teach these easy to understand stories, because those easy to understand stories, that when we give them weight and authority, they kind of go deeply into us, and they become the way we interpret the world around us subconsciously. They're not things we think about, they are the way we think. But they get there because we've thought about them. And so as children we grow up listening to them. And so we think about them, and therefore they become the way we think. And so I think with hope, and I think about the fact that God can come through, but when he comes through, he doesn't come through with power that destroys my enemies. He comes through with power that wants to embrace my enemies. And actually that mix of narratives, as was being said in this kind of little debate, Jordan Peters and Sam Harris, in which Sam Harris then stumbled over and didn't really ever have an answer for, which is actually, if you think yourself smugly, oh, that because I know so much better, and some things that Christians think I can demonstrate with science are wrong, which of course is true, they can, because some things that Christians think will be wrong, just as some things that atheists think will be right. We are millions of people in a world with all sorts of different things going on. But you get down to the fundamentals, you get down to the heart kind of issues. You get down to the heart issues. The thing that Jordan Peterson was kind of driving at with Sam is, you've lost those narratives at the deep level. Do you think that the world is going to stay the way you think it is? You've got this naive belief that it will stay kind of basically good. But actually basically good, the history is, even within Christendom, while certain sections of society would behave in certain ways, it took a very long time. It takes multiple generations for it to get right the way through every kind of echelon, and very often it's the ruling class that thinks itself above those things. It's what happened in the Roman world under Constantine, of course, as he imposes Christianity and realizes it's good for the it's good for the empire, but he himself doesn't think of himself as a Christian, although there's that kind of debate as to whether he did at the end or not. He sees the benefits of it. It's often the way with the ruling class. They see the benefits of it for society, then they give themselves the excuse to kind of live differently. But eventually it kind of captures to everybody. So even those who are in power, even your Epsteins or whatever, have to answer to an assumption of the people who's saying, well, no, we accept these things as good, we accept these things as good, but we mustn't forget where the source of them is. And because actually history tells us it was uniquely, you don't find it in any other part of the world, in any other religious system outside of the Judeo-Christian one, which is the emergence of the things which the West kind of likes to say, these are our basic fundamental human rights and values, and they are self-evident. Well, they're not self-evident. They are, sometimes we don't realise where they come from, because those stories are so embedded in our heart, but they come very genuinely from the telling of the gospel story, from the telling of God's story, and to letting those things seep into us so they become, if you like, our templates, our sets for action. I kind of pick up that kind of Jungian thinking sometimes. In our hearts we have objects and we have stages set for action. The stories that we tell actually tell us how to behave. You see, the objects on the stage, well, we can do those very well with science. But once you've arranged them on the stage, those objects are arranged on the stage, we're looking for stories to tell us how to act. And in that there is nothing that surpasses we often refer to as the greatest story ever told. But I can remember as a kid thinking very much a bit like it happens on the Vicar of Dibley episodes, where you're thinking, I think Lord of the Rings is a pretty good story. It's because we don't fully understand the whole dynamic of it. In its simplicity, to get into the heart, and out of that percolate the values that we take for granted, but do need protecting. They need teaching to our children properly, and they need articulating. So it's partly why I was doing this morning. So anyway, trying to keep it tight and short. So we're heading back to a part of the river where the dogs might go in. Turn the camera around. Wasn't around for the last couple of days because it's my 29th wedding anniversary, so just took a little bit of time in the mornings, but back now, and normally I kind of get to do about 5 days out of each 7. Watch out! I've over the summer I've just been redoing one of the kids' bedrooms because all our kids have left home now. Turned it into a nice little office for me with some filming space. So I'm going to start trying to do some more deliberately planned videos from there as we get into the autumn. So watch out for those. But until then, I will say goodbye and look forward to catching up with you tomorrow. And thanks for those that leave comments and leave notes, and they're really encouraging. Of course, it means to know that you should do that. You've had to watch right the way through to the end already. So if you've got this far, just take that extra little bit of effort. You can let me know you've been listening. That'd be fantastic. So until then, till tomorrow, I'll say goodbye. and try and find a way home that keeps me in the shade. Bye then.